Okay, well, welcome to our webinar on AI regulation around the world, exploring the global AI landscape, part of our monthly Policy Hour series. So as some of our audience members know, and for those of you new to our Policy Hour series, we here at Holistic AI are an AI governance, risk, and compliance company. And we grew from the UCL Computer Science Department and combined academic research with industry experience to create a scalable solution to make AI safer and fairer through risk mapping, risk mitigation, auditing, and assurance. And I'm Dr. Monica Lopez, Senior Policy Expert here at Holistic AI, and I'm going to be your host for today's webinar. Joining us later in our discussion on AI in India is Jai Vipra. She's an AI policy researcher in India at the AI Now Institute and has been doing work in competition policy for AI, has worked with a range of stakeholders and focuses on the impact of AI for developing countries. And again, she will be joining us later. Now, I do want to note that we will be holding a Q&A at the end. So please write in your questions at any time in the Q&A box, and we will get to as many questions as possible, of course, as time permits. So to start us off, I want to give us a high-level reminder of why this discussion of AI regulatory approaches across the globe is so important. It's certainly clear that AI is having a transformative power across every sector and is affecting how we work, we socialize, and we live, and there's pressing need for its governance and the international collaboration of such. And this is really because AI is evolving rapidly, especially generative AI, and its advancement is truly unparalleled. It's been suggested that its potential economic contribution could be anywhere between 10 to 15 trillion by 2030. And we also know now all too well that while AI offers an immense number of benefits, it also poses many risks, those that are known and those that are unknown. And those range from amplifying biases and discriminatory practices to enabling authoritarian surveillance. And I must also, as a final mention, we have to be aware of the malicious use of AI to supporting the enablement of nefarious behavior, which can range from causing significant psychological damage to facilitating cyber attacks to organizations and governments. So as AI tech continues to advance, to proliferate, and really reshape our world, it has become even more important to stay abreast of how tech regulation and innovation are being balanced across the globe. And while many of us here are based in the United States or in the UK and in Europe, we do have here at Holistic an even broader international clientele and audience. And as we all know, AI transcends borders. So major players include certainly the United States, the UK, Europe, China, and Canada, as they serve some of the largest markets across the globe. And as we're going to be seeing soon, these nations are signaling distinct approaches to enforcement, with these approaches often reflecting their broader philosophies on AI governance. And what's more, we really believe here that they offer helpful insights, really demonstrating important points on the spectrum of enforcement methodologies that are taking shape right now in real time. So whether you're on the product development or on the policy side of the AI ecosystem, companies worldwide will be subject to various enforcement measures. And so we're here to underscore the importance of being aware of both similarities and differences. So some AI governance enforcement regimes worth following right now, and those that we're going to briefly cover, because there's a lot certainly to cover, are the United States, the UK, Europe, Canada, China, Brazil, and India. And as an aside, this does not mean that other parts of the world like the LAC or Latin America and Caribbean regions more broadly, the nations of Africa and Southeast Asia, for example, are not developing AI and or digital governance strategies and mechanisms. Some of them certainly are, and moving along in very interesting ways. We will only slightly touch upon them in comparison to the much larger players today that are dominating the AI governance space. So to start, I'm going to briefly walk through developments in the United States. And in the absence of comprehensive U.S. federal AI legislation, 30 states and the District of Columbia have introduced about now over 150 AI-related bills since 2019. And AI governance enforcement essentially now relies on existing agencies to clarify and enforce prevailing guardrails for AI deployment. Now, some of these agencies, for which you may be familiar with, include the Federal Trade Commission, or FTC, the Department of Justice, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, and the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. Now, wider AI governance policy also includes efforts by the White House and Congress, and in particular, we know that there's the blueprint for an AI Bill of Rights that was released by the Office of Science and Technology Policy in October of last year, which was essentially a suggested set of guidelines for the responsible design and use of AI. Now, I highlight the above regulatory bodies because they recently unveiled a collective pledge to combat discrimination and bias in automated systems. And the pledge reaffirms that existing legal authorities apply to the use of automated systems. And the pledge also commits to protecting individuals' rights, regardless of whether legal violations occur through traditional means or advanced technologies. So essentially, they're emphasizing that while AI tools may be novel, they are not exempt from existing rules. And it is therefore the agency's responsibility to ensure that such technology is indeed developed and used in a manner consistent with federal laws. And the FTC has perhaps been the most vocal about its authority to enforce federal law in the context of AI. So in short, we can say that the US really is taking more of an ad hoc approach to the regulatory enforcement of AI governance and is essentially bolstered by the FTC as the default regulator. Now, as we can see here in this map of the United States, state-level proposed AI legislation indicates a heightened focus on the impact of emerging technologies within specific states. Not surprisingly, legislation has moved quite quickly, in fact, in states with technology hubs, including such areas like Silicon Valley in California, New York City, New York, Seattle, Washington, Illinois, and Denver, Colorado. And in the interest of time, I will just highlight some very few examples here. There's Colorado's Senate Bill 2169, legislation addressing discrimination in insurance practices, in which insurers are prohibited from unfair discrimination in insurance practices. There's also the landmark New York City Local Law 144, which was officially enforced on July 5th of this year, which essentially prohibits an employer or employment agency from using automated employment decision tools for an employment decision. And of course, unless that within 1 year prior to using that decision tool, it's been subject to a bias audit. And then prior to using that decision tool, a summary of the bias audit and the distribution date has been posted on the employer or employment agency's website. Another example is California's AB 331 Automated Decision Tools Bill, which prohibits the use of automated decision tools that contribute to results in algorithmic discrimination. Another example is Colorado's Senate Bill 21169 that was enacted in 2021, which seeks to prevent unfair discrimination in insurance practices with customer data or algorithms. Also in Illinois, there have been two big changes. There's the AI Video Interview Act, which came into effect on January 1st of 2020, and it essentially requires employers who use AI to analyze video interviews of job applicants to inform candidates that AI is being used to assess their suitability, how the AI works, and which characteristics will be used in the evaluation. Also in Illinois, the legislature unanimously passed the Biometric Information Privacy Act, or BIPA, in 2008, which establishes standards for how companies must handle consumers' biometric information. And so as more states create regulations and requirements for developing and deploying AI-enabled technologies, the challenge that I want to highlight here really becomes dealing with the conflicts that may arise between competing statutes across state lines. And what this means is that conflicting rules may lead to the inability of users to access certain products or processes within states, because state laws only protect residents in those specific states. Say, for example, the California Consumer Privacy Act. And this is now an issue that is up for debate as to what needs to be done at the federal level, since the federal law would adequately protect an example of privacy for all consumers. Now, at the federal level in the United States, regarding proposed federal guardrails, several bills have been introduced. And most notably, I will just highlight a few of them here. There's the Algorithmic Accountability Act of 2022. And in that particular case, the bill requires certain businesses that use automated decision systems to make critical decisions, to study and report about the impact of those systems on consumers. There's also the AI Disclosure Act of 2023, introduced this past June, and the bill would require generative AI to include on any output it produces a disclaimer notice that the output has indeed been generated by AI. There's also been proposed the No Robot Bosses Act, which would protect and empower workers by preventing employers from relying exclusively on AI or bots to make any sort of employment decision, and thus require some level of human involvement in the employment decision process. And for the AI Training Act, for example, the bill would require the director of the Office of Management and Budget to establish or otherwise provide an AI training program for the acquisition workforce within the executive branch of the federal government, among other purposes. And so, among other proposed bills listed here and many others, all of this is to say that, as I mentioned before, the United States is taking more of a use case specific approach to the regulatory enforcement of AI governance. Now, as we presented, you were able to attend our webinar in the UK last month, where we focused on innovation and regulation in the UK. We saw that the UK has also been rather active this particular year. So I'll just highlight a few issues here. So specifically, a new Department for Science, Innovation and Technology, or DSIT, was created in February, precisely to support efforts to be at the forefront of science and technology innovation. Then in March, that same department, along with the Office for AI, published a white paper, now very well known, detailing a light touch pro-innovation and pro-business approach to AI regulation. So very much in alignment with the US and with the goal to foster essentially further economic growth. Now, of note, there are 5 common principles meant to increase public trust in AI by addressing risks and protecting fundamental values, which I'll highlight here just really quickly, include safety, security, and robustness, appropriate transparency and explainability, fairness, accountability and governance, and contestability and redress. So with no new legislation, regulators from their respective sectors will instead be guiding and policing the development and deployment of AI based on a non-statutory framework informed by the 5 principles I just mentioned. So moreover, the UK government right now essentially has and continue to advocate in terms of being committed to establishing a regulatory sandbox for innovators and regulators to work together. And finally, the UK has also very expressively stated its commitment to engaging with international partners to support interoperability across different regulatory regimes. Now, moving to the current European approach, in comparison to the non-regulatory infrastructure and robust pro-innovation approach espoused by the United States and the UK, the EU has taken what many would say is more of a focused, human-centered approach based on developing trustworthy technology that is safe and doesn't violate fundamental human rights. So as a result, since March of 2018, the EU has been actively drafting guidelines for the ethical development and use of AI based on the EU's fundamental rights, all the way to aiming to address the risk generated by specific uses of AI through a set of complementary, proportionate, and flexible rules, and as such becoming the idea here is to become the gold standard of what it means to build and use technology that is grounded in ethics. And so the EU approach to AI risk management is characterized by a more comprehensive range of legislation that is tailored to specific digital environments, as well as enabling more public transparency and influence over the design of AI systems in social media and e-commerce. And with the rise and ubiquity of digital platforms, and in line with supporting a central vision of ensuring beneficial technology for society, the EU has been working to create a safer, fairer, and more transparent online environment. And landmark digital rules, there's the Digital Markets Act and the Digital Services Act, or respectively known as the DMA and DSA, which were adopted on the 5th of July last year, and both came into force November of last year. And the Digital Services Act will be directly applicable across the EU by, in fact, February of next year, and with very large platforms and very large online search engines having to comply with their obligations, in fact, earlier. So the European Commission has designated that the first set of very large platforms must comply by the 25th of April of this year. The Digital Markets Act entered into force in November, as last year, as I mentioned, and its rules started to apply on May 2nd, actually, of this year. And so really briefly, what these different acts relate to is that the Digital Markets Act regulates big tech practices, essentially, by ensuring a level playing field for all digital companies, regardless of their size. And so the regulation essentially lays down a set of clear rules for big platforms to stop them from imposing unfair conditions on businesses and consumers. The idea here is for the rules to boost innovation, growth, competitiveness, essentially helping smaller companies and startups to compete with large players. Now, the Digital Services Act is about providing users with a safer digital space by giving them more control over what they see online. So this means users will have better information over why specific content is recommended to them, and they can therefore choose an option that does not include, for example, something like profiling. So the idea here is for the new rules to help protect users from harmful and illegal content. Now, the EU AI Act sets out core horizontal rules for the development, trade, and use of AI-driven products, services, and systems within the territory of the EU that apply to all industries. And the European Commission has published a proposal for a new directive on the liability of defective products. They published it last September to revise the existing product liability directive that was adopted many years ago in 1985. So the idea here is that the proposal introduces new provisions to address liability for products like software and digital services that affect how the product works. And so it also alleviates the burden of proof for victims under certain circumstances. And the proposed rules would also ensure that consumers are compensated for defective products manufactured outside of the EU. Now, within the EU bloc, all I want to highlight here is that separately nations have been establishing their own national AI strategies, their own related guidelines on algorithmic data, the creation of an algorithmic registry in some nations, and other such initiatives like establishing regulatory sandboxes to essentially place themselves at the forefront of AI innovation. And if you have been abreast with news with EU members, we know that just last week, EU member Spain just established the first designated AI regulatory body. Now, moving to Canada, we can note some certain developments. So last year in June of 2022, the Government of Canada tabled the AI and Data Act, known as AIDA, and it is essentially part of Bill C-27, the Digital Charter Implementation Act. And it's significant for several reasons that I want to highlight here. First, it's an important milestone in implementing the Digital Charter. Second, it's a first step to encouraging responsible adoption of AI technology by Canadians and Canadian businesses. Third, it has drawn from and worked with partners in the EU, the UK, and the US precisely to align approaches and remain interoperable with international markets. Fourth, it's using a risk-based approach. It was actually specifically designed to reflect and align with evolving international norms in the AI space. And by that, I mean specifically, it includes the EU AI Act that I just mentioned, the OECD's AI principles, and also in the United States, the risk management framework that came out of the National Institute of Standards and Technology. And the idea is that it's aligning with those particular norms, but also integrating that within existing Canadian legal frameworks. And as a final point of its significance, it really is a move to ensure that Canadians are protected globally and that Canadian firms can be recognized internationally as meeting a robust set of standards. So of note here, reinforcing Canada's pro-innovation approach to AI development and use, the AIDA, is actually very general legislation. It states the domains to which it applies and creates a foundation for the directions of the government, which direction the government would like to go, but it actually does not provide specifics. So as an example, AIDA states that high impact AI must undertake certain in-depth assessments, but it actually doesn't define what high impact means, and it doesn't say what those assessments should be. Now, to move on to China, compared to what we've been discussing here with the US, the UK, the EU, and Canada, China has been certainly rolling out some of the world's earliest and most detailed regulations governing AI. And these include measures governing recommendation algorithms to newer rules for synthetically generated images and chatbots similar to those of ChatGPT. And as with other world powers, AI is seen as a strategic technology with significant economic value, and therefore the push has been to actively promote the development and adoption of AI within the nation and to ensure product alignment with, in this particular case, the nation's socialist values. And of course, also in building of the bureaucratic toolkit to bolster government uptake. Now, to get into more specifics, as we can see here, there has been national level policy documents that explicitly and primarily target AI or algorithms for regulation or governance. Three of the most concrete and impactful regulations are its 2021 regulation on recommendation algorithms that has provisions for content control, the 2022 rules for synthetically generated content that prohibits the generation of fake news, and the 2023 draft rules on generative AI. So while the primary goal of all three measures is information control, there are also other provisions worth noting. So for example, the rules for recommendation algorithms bar excessive price discrimination and protect the rights of workers subject to algorithmic scheduling. The deep synthesis regulation, as another example, requires clearly visible labels that need to be placed on synthetically generated content. And finally, the draft generation AI regulation requires both the training data and the model outputs to be true and accurate. Now, I'm saying true and accurate in air quotes here because that is perhaps something that is of an impossibility, in fact, at this point, for AI chatbots to clear. Furthermore, all three regulations require developers to file the tech to China's algorithm registry, essentially a newly built government repository that gathers information on how algorithms are trained, and to also pass a security self-assessment. At the local level, Shanghai has passed regulation on boosting the development of AI industry. And the regulation, which actually was China's first provincial level one in the AI sector, went into effect last year in October of 2022. And AI is essentially one of three leading industries within Shanghai that seeks to develop through the concentration of resources like building and using public computing, resource platforms providing public computing power support and industrial development, as well as the establishment of an ethics committee. Taking effect in also last year in November, the regulations for the promotion of the AI industry in Shenzhen Special Economic Zone aims to promote AI in Shenzhen, one of China's large tech hubs, but it also stresses the importance of ethical guidelines for the use of AI technology to prevent AI systems from aiding discriminatory practices or infringing on individuals' privacy. Now, moving forward, I will just very briefly move here to Latin America and the Caribbean regions, otherwise known as LAC, with a particular focus on AI regulatory efforts in Brazil. And in the interest of time, I am lumping all the nations together here. And as is well known and supported by research, as diverse as the landscapes are of all the various regions across the continent, so too, in fact, are the various stages and levels of capacity regarding AI development, their proposal and publication of a national AI strategy, as well as commitment to OECD principles, and in fact, very specific proposals for AI regulation, among other issues. Instead, what is clear from the most recent publication of the first Latin American AI Index, which was just presented a couple of weeks ago in Santiago, Chile, is that efforts around AI and digital innovation more broadly are ascribing to support the transformation of development models, of the building of an environment that can enable AI development, like digital infrastructure, like data availability and data skills. And there's a real significant call for regional and multilateral cooperation and collaboration, really, given the limited voice that these regions have had over global AI governance discussions. And finally, that the AI index that I just mentioned really puts out forward a vision about aligning the development of AI with inclusivity and sustainability, such that the approach in the end is fundamentally human-centered and responsible. Now, as a snapshot, a very specific example, I'll mention Brazil. So approved in December of last year, the legal framework for AI defines the principles of AI systems and the rights of people affected by them, as well as risk classification standards and governance and transparency measures that organizations involved at any stage of an AI system's lifecycle must observe. And the AI framework also establishes sanctions if its provisions are not complied with, and assigns the executive branch the responsibility to designate an authority to implement and enforce the AI framework. If approved, the framework will take effect 1 year after being signed into law. Now, the commission was appointed in March of 2022, and it analyzed several bills, including bill number 5051 of 2019, which would define principles for using AI in Brazil, and bills number 21 of 2020 and 872 of 2021, which were approved by the House of Representatives, for which both would regulate the use of AI. So as we've seen in other parts of the world, the principles determined by the Commission for using and developing AI systems across the nation are, as expected, include human participation in the AI lifecycle and effective human supervision, non-discrimination, intelligibility, transparency, explainability, and auditability, the reliability and robustness of AI systems, the traceability of decisions made throughout the AI lifecycle, and a responsible individual or legal entity for such decisions. Also, of importance is including accountability, responsibility, and full remediation for damages, as well as finally, precaution, prevention, and mitigation of systemic risks. So now we are going to move to India. And finally, as I open our discussion with our guest panelist, Jai Vipra from the AI Now Institute, I will mention a summary of developments in India regarding the nation's approach to AI regulations. But before I do that, just Jai, thank you for joining us and for coming onto the scene here. Can you just please remind the audience what you do in India with respect to AI policy?
Yeah, hi, Monica. Thanks so much for having me here. I'm an AI policy researcher, and my latest work has been on competition policy for foundation models across the world. And I'm also currently working with the AI Now Institute on a project on compute markets and compute regulation for AI. Having said that, I do want to mention that I don't speak on behalf of AI Now today, and just in my own personal capacity, but I'm excited to be here.
Thank you, Jai, for that. So I'm going to ask you a few questions, but before I do so, I just want to mention a few dates and events here of note. So in February of 2021, NITI Aayog, the government of India's essentially a highest level of public policy think tank, published a report titled Principles for Responsible AI. And the report was essentially an approach document building further from the national strategy on AI. And it explores various ethical challenges of AI adoption across both system considerations, like the usual problems of lack of understanding inherent in AI functioning, algorithmic transparency, and also address societal considerations like the impact on jobs due to the automation of tasks currently being performed by the Indian workforce. Subsequent drafts have followed, but fast forward to April of this year, the Ministry of Electronics and IT signaled that they were not considering any law to regulate the AI sector, essentially arguing that while AI adoption across various sectors has elucidated ethical concerns and associated risks, it has been much more of an enabler of the digital and innovation ecosystem across the nation, which interestingly, just last month in July, the telecommunications regulator, which is the Telecom Regulatory Authority of India, or TRAI, just came out with a consultation paper suggesting that a domestic statutory authority should be set up to regulate AI through the lens of a risk-based framework, as well as for a call essentially for greater international collaboration in forming a global body or agency for the responsible use of AI. And then just recently, as now that the G20 summit is to be held in September in New Delhi, Prime Minister Modi called for a global framework on the expansion of ethical AI tools. So Jai, turning now to you, can you comment on this particular change in the government's stance on initially not regulating AI, but now calling for regulation? Would you say that this is some sort of a move to have more leadership in this evolving debate that we're seeing across the world about having convergence across what it means to regulate the AI sector?
Yeah, I think so. I think there are a few things happening here. One, that AI as we understand it has changed quite a bit in this timeline. So, its capabilities have improved quite a bit, as well as I think that the geopolitical importance of AI has become clearer with export controls and then retaliatory export controls and so on. And so I think that India is, while at first said that there was nothing to be done at the moment, it is now deciding at least to wait and watch. And I do think that it will wait until the regulatory frameworks of other countries become more concrete and start to be implemented. Because there is a lot that is changing very quickly. So while the minister said that there is nothing to worry about in relation to employment, I expect that the impact on jobs will become clearer too in time. And so perhaps this stance will change as well. But there is, of course, no clear line, as we know, between impact and the law. And so I'm willing to bet with a little bit of certainty, not too much, that there will not be many big moves in this particular domain, especially as we head into an election year. But perhaps there will be inclusion of some of these issues in the Digital India Act that is upcoming, in the Digital Competition Act that is upcoming. But perhaps that there will be more piecemeal regulation meanwhile. So, you might know that in the past, digital regulation in India has been carried out by various agencies. For instance, even the Reserve Bank, the central bank, has had data localization requirements and so on. So I think we need to look quite broader rather than at a comprehensive law. And yeah, I think you're right that India's hosting of the G20 plays a role in this. The expansion of the BRICS plays a role in this. And so international coordination and collaboration in the domain of AI is becoming much more important in India's strategic priorities.
Well, and so to go back to that initial Principles for Responsible AI report, there were 7 principles that were discussed in terms of managing responsible AI. And to remind our listeners, in case they don't know which they are essentially safety and reliability, equality, inclusivity, non-discrimination, principle of privacy, security, transparency, accountability, and a principle for the protection and reinforcement of positive human values. So from your perspective, how feasible do you see for these principles to be adopted, whether by businesses, organizations, or even the government itself?
Yeah, I think that is quite a layered question, because feasibility really depends on the context. And I do think that the Niti Aayog report with those 7 principles was quite forward-looking for its time. It was, quite comprehensive, and identified some of the risks very astutely. But I think that feasibility really depends quite heavily on political will. So, for instance, even if you look at something as simple as the principle of equality, where the algorithm, as it were, is supposed to treat like persons and like circumstances the same, and you apply it to gig workers, and you apply it to platforms, for instance, penalizing gig workers who try to lead unions through algorithmic management. It's up in the air as to whether this principle will apply quite fairly in this situation to the gig worker, just given the sort of power differential. So I think these principles have the sort of come with the pitfalls of all principle-based legislation or principle-based regulation, is that it can be quite tricky to apply these fairly in different situations, and it really depends on the socioeconomic and political power of the different players.
And certainly as well with how we define them. So the operational definitions, taking, for example, something like transparency, where in and of itself, there are so many definitions for what that means in terms of algorithmic explainability and interpretability.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that a lot of those definitions sometimes, get clarified or become more detailed through legal dispute processes. And that's something to watch out for. Courts end up defining a lot of this.
Well, and so if we sort of go back to comparing with what we were mentioning and in the US and in Europe, there's actually been a lot more and more talk, and really the need now and emerging requirement for risk assessments and independent auditing of AI systems. So in your opinion, do you see that as useful and as something that could become an emerging demand in India, as well as we have all of this happening within the Indian AI pipeline and overall ecosystem?
I think so. I think it's going to be extremely important, if only to arrest some runaway problems that you might have with, AI implementation and deployment in particular. And I think it's doubly important when the context is not something you always expect, which is often the case in India or in developing countries. The situations can be so complex and can often not be foreseen by developers or AI companies. And I think that in such cases, auditing and risk assessment tends to be very, very important. I do think that the Data Protection Act has mandatory auditing. So I see AI-related legislation also having that in the future in some form.
So if you were to say the key points of where India is headed in the near future and maybe the far future for each one, what would you say as the take-home message?
I think one is that India is yet to decide on its regulatory philosophy for the digital sector. It tends to veer between wanting businesses to not leave, but also wanting to protect its strategic priorities. But I think that India does, objectively need to secure its place in the value chain for AI, and that is going to be an area to watch. So it might follow the EU or some other countries where it's feasible, is potentially in the regulation of final AI systems, like the TRAI risk-based framework. but it might take its own path elsewhere, potentially in the production of these systems, especially in relation to data sharing and data use, for instance. So, and perhaps even in compute at some point. So I think I would separate these two while looking at India.
And to piggyback briefly on your comments there, what would you say in terms of the efforts being done to upskill the nation and the workforce, especially now that we have a generative AI and taking over automating tasks essentially?
Yeah, I think that I don't think that enough attention is being paid to that, to be quite honest. It was a priority in the Niti Aayog report, but you need like lots more activity happening in that domain to be really prepared. In fact, at first you need a clear-eyed assessment of what the employment impact is going to be in order to reskill workers. So I don't think even that exists so far. So we're a long way away.
Well, and so also as another point that came to mind as you were mentioning that, I'm sure you're aware of the current situation in which many are calling digital sweatshops, in which we have individuals from in India as well as other from other parts of the global south, working essentially at very low rates for categorizing and cleaning up and fixing and the data that is being used to power the systems here that are created in the United States. So what are your thoughts in regards to that situation, and has it received enough attention? Is there potential for change, or is it something that is going to sort of continue almost in the background with these now changing efforts?
Yeah, I think that situation is frankly quite exploitative. It has not received enough attention. And sadly, I think if India does not find a better place in the value chain in terms of how it did, after the Y2K crisis, which is what led to India's IT industry really booming and having the sort of expertise you see now. If India is not able to find that sort of inflection point and the entryway into this global market, I think it's going to have to settle for low value jobs like this, and which tend to be quite exploitative and which no one should be doing at these low rates of compensation. I think that as of now, there is not enough recognition of this. In fact, there's an increasing loosening of labor legislation that is starting to weaken labor protection, and so I don't think that this direction is being, is correct at the moment.
Okay, so I'm going to move and see what we have in the Q&A. So hold one moment here as I open that. So one question that is brought up here is, I will read directly. There's perhaps we're rushing into deploying AI tech without considering all the implications. Where are we in terms of AI alignment? Jai, since we have you here and we've been talking about this in regards to India and aligning with ethical principles, do you have any thoughts you wanted to mention further about that?
Yeah, AI alignment, in my view, is an extremely difficult problem, both from the technical side as well as on the social side. And, while people are making the effort to solve it on the technical side, I think that a lot more thinking and effort needs to happen on the social side in terms of just trying to figure what people even actually want from AI. And I think a lot more sort of democratic or inclusive processes in terms of designing these systems and as well as deploying them can be useful to make it socially aligned.
So essentially what we're seeing a similar problem in regards to how we define these terms. We really need to understand when we talk about alignment, what do people want? Because research has shown that there is a disconnect between those who are creating the technology simply because they're in a different context of developing the technology, advancing it, the scientific aspect of it, versus the general public, who, of course, hears through the media, through different sources about what the reality of the technology is. And so understanding what people want from these systems really does become a challenge to truly define that. Another question that came here, and let's see if you want to answer it, and then I can follow, is should we fear harmful AI or its malicious use by deceptive humans? So what's this? Is there a tension in India in regards to addressing malicious use, let's say in the area of cyber attacks, for example?
Yeah, I think there's about as much attention as there is in other countries, with the exception, I suppose, of the US, which over where there is a lot of attention to this question. But, I'm not familiar with the sort of very specific thinking in this regard. But yeah, I think that, of course, we should be fearful of these possibilities, but also of the possibility of AI being embedded into socioeconomic systems and making them worse. But I'm interested in hearing what you think about that as well.
Right. My response to that would be that it's not so much that we should be afraid of the AI system per se. It's really about, at the end of the day, it's us humans who are creating these systems, we're mirroring our biases, our stereotypes, our expectations, our desires, wants, our actions, our behaviors through these systems. And so I would say that more than anything, we really need to be thinking about how humans use these technologies to enact certain nefarious, certain deceptive type of behaviors. So if anything, these technologies certainly are allowing for a much greater propagation of such, facilitation of such. But I would argue that really the problem still stems from the human. Okay, moving on to another question here. So, should there be a global universal basic income to buffer the disruption of the labor market through AI and prevent civil unrest? So I think this actually, we were talking about here, Jai, with you, India. Any comments on that regard?
Yes and no. I think if there is a certain future where we very rapidly automate everything, and there are no jobs to do, obviously, yes, there has to be some sort of universal basic income, but also that we shouldn't stop there. Production systems, ultimately, when we talk about the economy, we talk about production and exchange and so on, and here we're probably not talking about exchange, we're talking about production. And I think that if all production is automated, there is no good reason for very few people to have input into that production and on what is produced and how it is produced and how much. And I think that if there are no jobs, there ought to be a lot more democratic input into production. So, yeah, UBI, yes, but don't stop at that, I think.
So really a more holistic approach to how we address this question
because, there's income, there's money, but we also have to think about what is being produced and if people's needs are being met through production that is completely automated, or if only, a certain type of good is being produced to meet the needs of very few people, or the wants of very few people. So I think that it's a radical answer for a very radical model of the future. So,
well, kind of continuing from that, and this is from a question further here, is what is happening in schools, for example, or curriculum changes, if any, in regards to actually preparing the workforce? So if indeed, well, not if, changes are happening, but in terms of, when they're going to happen, that's still an open question in terms of the adoption of the technology in all sectors and how profound that is. So what's happening in terms of preparing the next set of leaders and technologists in India, for example?
I think that there needs to be first clarity from either the government or the industry, but ideally both, on where they see India placed on the global value chain, and therefore what people should study or train for. And in the absence of that clarity today, I think this is very difficult to answer. So, it's going to take a mix of policy, international sort of diplomacy, as well as industry efforts to find the answer to this question. So I think that there's very little that educational institutions can do on their own.
Right. So sort of to continue from that and to give the example of the United States, there's definitely a demand from industry in terms of needing to have the technical expertise, but also because of the risks and the harms that have become far more evident and transparent to the general public, there is also a call for ethics training and computer ethics and AI ethics. And so I would just add there that I absolutely agree with you in that regard, that we do need, again, in this particular context, also a holistic approach to both government and industry really working together in partnership in that regard. But efforts are happening. And I think, if anything, we should be starting from very young, not just at the university college level, but really starting from kindergarten so that children who are already utilizing this technology, essentially using it since infancy, but they actually understand it and they come to understand it in a much deeper level.
Yeah, exactly.
So another question that came up here is, new job roles. What new job roles do you think we see AI creating in decades ahead? Anything that maybe you've seen people suggesting in India? What could be sort of the future automated job?
I've thought about this, but I don't have very concrete examples to give. So I think maybe you're better placed in holistic AI to really answer this one.
Well, that's a huge question. In fact, a very complex one. And certainly I would say that we have to be mindful that every sector, every industry is being affected by the technology, and many aspects are vertically, horizontally are going to be automated. And so the question really becomes, what is the usefulness of that within, let's say, the organization or within the particular product or service that's being created? And then ultimately, as we know, AI is the power of AI really is dependent on the data from which it is trained on. And so that becomes fundamental to what type of system you're going to end up developing, and really having the capability to develop, which actually reminds me right now in terms of something we didn't really discuss, and I'd love to hear your opinion on, is the issue of sustainability. So we know that these systems, as we just mentioned, require enormous amounts of data, and the carbon footprint due to the compute power needed for such is very high. Have there been discussions? Is it of priority? What are people thinking what is the government thinking in India, or organizations in India, in regards to the problem of climate change and sustainability of these systems?
Yeah, I think in India, it's a way, as elsewhere over the last few weeks, but especially in India over the last few years, climate change has been a very real and present problem, not a problem that's in the future. And I think it really opens up the question of should we be allocating so many ecological resources to these products and services, to, for instance, a chatbot, do we really need to use this much energy for a chatbot, for instance? And I don't think that anyone has a very convincing answer. And yeah, I do wish there was lots more research into the energy use um, of AI systems, especially very large AI systems and hyperscalers and so on.
Okay, well, thank you for that. We're really heading towards now the close of our webinar series today. But before we do that, I just want to, I think this is a perfect moment really to think about what's headed, what's the future looking like, especially for all the different regions that we discuss today. And so really quickly, I'd like to say that in regards to the United States, it really is up for debate what the best strategy is. Significant interest lies right now in really moving forward at the federal level, given the patchwork of legislation we saw at the local and state levels, and what that means for interoperability of expectations of these systems. And so right now, we know that the Biden-Harris administration has been reaching out to tech leaders and civil society and experts, really they're still gathering insights into how to develop policies for a U.S. approach on AI policy. In regards to the UK, we know that PM Sunak is slated to hold the first major AI safety summit at Bletchley Park, no less, this coming November. So the goal being to discuss exactly, in fact, how AI risks can be mitigated through this international coordinated action that really all of the major powers have been calling for this point. And the EU, as we know, also is in the trialogue negotiations with the EU AI Act right now between the European Parliament, the European Council, and European Commission. And they are now aiming to reach the final agreement on the text of the act. And certainly still topics of contention, still up for debate, are the definition of what an AI system is, along with what this means for the categories of systems that qualify as high risk and which should be ultimately banned. China, we know, is moving very fast. And their AI governance legislation continues to contain very explicit reference to enforcement mechanisms. As for Canada, well, many people are kind of skeptical about the AI and Data Act, AIDA, and it has actually already gone through its second reading by the Parliament just this past April. So there are still many outstanding points regarding really the balance between leaving room for innovation, but also leaving room for uncertainty about what's allowable by industry's actions in regards to the use and development of AI. And then last but not least, certainly Latin America and the Caribbean, they are very well aware of their need for capacity building and policy continuity. So that is also up right at the table. Also, I did not mention Africa, and I should just very briefly say that what we know so far, there was a document published last year, exactly a year ago, in September, in fact, and it essentially highlights that there is wide use of AI technologies across all the different nations, but there certainly is also a general lack of dedicated, all-encompassing AI legislation and also national AI strategies, with really only mainly Tunisia, Mauritius, and Egypt with having already created national strategies. And as we mentioned with India finally here, the G20 summit is around the corner, and it's certainly going to be a moment where these issues that we have already discussed will be up on the stage very prominently. So as I now close today's webinar, I want to thank Jai, our speaker here, our panelist, for her insights, as well as for our audience for listening to us. And if you're interested in staying further abreast on these topics that we discussed, please join the waiting list to have access to our newest global AI information database called The Guide, that we have created to be your go-to tool for exploring AI developments across the world. And you can go to guide.holisticai.com and you can sign up directly there. So once again, thank you for coming to this Policy Hour webinar. You're going to be receiving an email recap from it But before you log off, just take note that we will be having our next policy hour on Thursday, September 28th at 3 p.m. BST, in which we will be discussing navigating responsible governance in generative AI. So please check out our social media newsletter in the coming days to find out more and to sign up. So thank you once again for joining us, and hope to see you again in September. Thank you.